Lawyers. What's the most brutal courtroom takedown you've witnessed from an opposing lawyer? I remember the way the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead and how they seemed to flicker in time with my racing pulse. It was the final day of the trial, and every seat in the courtroom was taken. People stood along the back wall, some even leaning against the doors, craning their necks to see what was about to unfold. I could practically feel the tension crawling across my skin, an electric hum of excitement and dread all wrapped together. My throat went dry when I saw her, Alyssa Merrick, the opposing counsel, rising from her chair with that calm, almost lazy confidence that made every eye fix on her. She was known across half the state for her cold, precise dismembering of witnesses, and I had the eerie feeling that today she'd sharpened her blade just for me. Let me back up just a little, because this story didn't start here, though this is the moment that still haunts my dreams. I was a junior associate at Finch & Adler, a law firm that had a decent reputation in corporate cases but rarely took on anything that promised high media coverage. My boss, Daniel Hughes, was the partner running the show in the office, and for better or worse, he had decided to give me, of all people, my first big break on a major case. I'd been working for him for nearly 3 years, mostly behind the scenes, doing research, drafting briefs, and preparing documents. But when a prominent local entrepreneur by the name of Garrett Palmer approached our firm, ready to sue his ex-business partner for alleged fraud and breach of contract, the stakes were sky high. Everyone was talking about the potential settlement, which hovered around 8 figures. And for reasons I still don't fully understand, Daniel thought I was ready to help lead the charge. Garrett Palmer was a tech startup guy. He'd built his name on a series of moderately successful apps that had garnered some attention from venture capitalists. One of his longtime friends, David Garrison, had invested in the early days, or so we believed, under a handshake agreement. Garrett claimed David had surreptitiously converted some of those funds into personal endeavors, siphoning away a hefty chunk of the capital. When we filed suit, I expected we'd be dealing with some local defense attorney from a mid-level firm. But no, David Garrison managed to secure representation from none other than Alyssa Merrick, a partner at a large-scale firm in the city. Rumor had it she had never lost a case that went to trial, or at least not in the last decade. That might have been an exaggeration, but let's just say her reputation loomed large. The first time I saw her in person was at a pre-trial hearing. She wore a charcoal gray suit, carried a leather portfolio under her arm, and walked with the kind of assurance that only comes from destroying half a dozen opposing counsels for breakfast. I was used to dealing with subtle intimidation, but she practically radiated a kind of cold menace. Her greeting was cordial enough, she even smiled politely, but there was zero warmth behind it. I heard her speak for the first time when the judge asked for preliminary statements. My heart hammered away like it wanted out of my chest. I can't even remember precisely what she said, but I remember how her voice didn't quake or falter, how she seemed to have no nerves, no hesitation. She pressed forward like an unstoppable train, systematically laying out their position. And this was just day one. Outside the courtroom, my boss patted me on the shoulder and joked, "Don't look so pale, Derek. She's not going to eat you," but I wasn't sure that was true. The next few weeks became a blur of depositions, filings, and late nights in the conference room. Garrett Palmer spent hours with me and the rest of the team, recounting how David had come to him with an initial investment and insisted the contract remain flexible while they hammered out details. That was a red flag if ever there was one. But according to Garrett, he trusted David wholeheartedly. They had been friends since college. Meanwhile, David insisted that any money he had taken was purely for business development. We pored over financial statements, bank transfers, and email threads. Some of it looked suspicious as hell, but suspicion isn't proof. Then came the depositions. I prepped Garrett for 2 days straight, drilling him on every question I could imagine Alyssa throwing at him. He was a decent witness. Open, earnest, sometimes too earnest. He wore his heart on his sleeve, which made him relatable but also vulnerable. When the day of his deposition arrived, Alyssa walked in with an air of practiced boredom, as if she'd done 1,000 such depositions that week and had already decided how it would all go down. She started politely saying, "Good morning, Mr. Palmer. I hope you had a pleasant drive," in a tone that sounded dangerously close to condescending. Then she went on to systematically dissect every assumption we had. She questioned the timeline, the handshake agreement, the nature of the missing funds. At one point, Garrett mentioned something about having emailed David a friendly reminder concerning some missing capital. Alyssa raised an eyebrow, fishing out a piece of paper from her folder. It was that same email. She read it aloud in a monotone. "Hey buddy, just noticing some funds missing from the main pot. Let me know if you borrowed it for something. No biggie, but we should keep track." She paused, scanning the text as if reading it for the first time. Then she said, "No biggie, Mr. Palmer, do you see how that phrasing might suggest you gave Mr. Garrison permission to use the funds as he saw fit? Garrett swallowed nervously and said something along the lines of, "Well, I didn't mean it that way. We just spoke in a friendly manner." Alyssa gave a tiny shrug. "The words are what they are, Mr. Palmer. Words matter. You said no, Biggie. Now, if you're alleging that Mr. Garrison committed fraud, shouldn't that have been a biggie to you?" He sputtered for a second, and I could feel my own chest tightening. She was good, dangerously good. She had a knack for twisting Garrett's own statements until they sounded incriminating. And that was just the deposition, not even the main event. Afterward, we retreated to our office. Garrett was visibly rattled. "My boss told me, we're going to have to step up our game. She's got a strategy, and she's laying the groundwork for it. We just need to figure out how to counter." I spent the next several days lost in boxes of documents, scanning them for any hidden line item, any email exchange that could back up Garrett's claims that David had deliberately siphoned the money. The stress wore on me. I wasn't sleeping well, and I was so keyed up that my usually supportive girlfriend, Miranda, started giving me strange looks. She'd ask why I was up at 2 in the morning, flipping through thousands of PDF pages on my laptop. The trial began on a blistering hot Monday in June. By then, the case had attracted a bit of local media interest. A few reporters hovered in the hallway outside the courtroom, and Garrett insisted that we make a statement. My boss politely discouraged that, reminding him that anything we said publicly could be spun or used against us. Inside, I set up our little war zone: laptops, stacks of manila folders with color-coded tabs, exhibit binders. Alyssa, by contrast, arrived with a single leather briefcase. That was it. She looked almost bored, which somehow made it more intimidating. The judge, the Honorable Sarah Wilkins, was known to be fair but not overly patient with theatrics. She listened carefully to the opening arguments. I delivered ours, explaining how we intended to prove that Garrison had breached fiduciary duties, engaged in deceptive practices, and effectively defrauded my client. I did my best to sound confident, to project that we had everything we needed to win. Then Alyssa stood up. Her voice was smooth, unwavering. She spoke to the jury like a teacher addressing a classroom of children. She explained that the so-called missing funds were nothing more than reallocated capital for marketing expenditures, and that Palmer had known about it the entire time. In fact, she said, Mr. Palmer gave Mr. Garrison express permission via email to handle the funds as he saw fit. She turned and gave the jurors a smile. "You'll see the email. You'll read Mr. Palmer's own words. After that, the story will speak for itself." If I had been able to take a snapshot of Garrett's face at that moment, it would have looked like someone had just informed him the plane was going down, and there weren't enough parachutes for everyone. Even though I had prepared him for this, hearing it in open court, with Alyssa's controlled voice weaving it into a narrative, sent a chill through him, and through me. Still, our first few witnesses held up decently under cross-examination. One was a former accountant of Garrett's, who testified that some of the money couldn't be accounted for, that it had never gone into any official marketing or development budget. Alyssa chipped away at him by highlighting minor discrepancies in the spreadsheets, making it seem like the accountant was prone to small mistakes that might have accounted for the missing funds. Step by step, she guided the jury to believe these were normal accounting errors. If I hadn't known better, I would have doubted my own position. We were about a week in when I realized we needed a piece of evidence that was more concrete. We needed something bulletproof, something that couldn't be twisted or explained away. I decided to dig deeper into a side LLC that David had formed right around the time the money started disappearing. It was registered in Delaware, a common practice for tax reasons, but the timing was suspicious. A little more digging, and I found a reference to a property investment in another state. It was small, just a piece of land that might have been used for a warehouse, but it connected to an address I'd seen mentioned in an email chain on David's end, the one we'd subpoenaed. If I could show that David had funneled funds from Garrett's company to buy that property, we might have had our smoking gun. Every night, I went home and collapsed on my couch, my mind racing. I'd think about Alyssa's face, that unreadable mask she wore. I pictured her gearing up for the next day, already spotting flaws in our arguments. My nights were restless, and I woke up each morning with fresh anxiety pounding in my temples. My saving grace came from one quiet conversation with a contact I had in a property management office out of state. After a few phone calls, I managed to get an email that directly linked David's name to the property. It wasn't conclusive by itself, but it was a strong lead. We introduced it to the court a few days later, and for the first time, I saw Alyssa Merrick's expression shift. Just the slightest tightening around her eyes, like she hadn't entirely expected us to find them. My heart soared with hope. but I should have known she had a counterattack ready. The next day, she called her own forensic accountant to the stand, who testified that the property had been purchased with funds from a different account entirely, an account that David had inherited from his late grandmother's estate. Suddenly, the evidence that had looked so promising was neutralized. The email might show David owned the property, but it didn't prove he used Garrett's money to buy it. That was the day I started to understand what people meant when they called Alyssa a shark. She didn't just rebut our evidence. She'd turn around and make us look like we were grasping at straws. As the trial wore on, the pressure mounted. Garrett was anxious. The press coverage had grown, and I was overwhelmed trying to keep up with the constant onslaught of motions, witness preps, and 1,000 other details. My boss did his best to guide me, but he had other cases he was overseeing, so a lot of it fell on my shoulders. One Friday afternoon, after a particularly grueling cross-examination where Alyssa had made our second accountant look foolish, I sat at my desk, my face buried in my hands. I thought, there's no way to win. She's too good at twisting everything around. The final week of trial arrived, and we were fast approaching the main event. Garrett Palmer himself on the stand, facing Alyssa's cross. This was it. If she tore him apart there, our entire case could crumble, because all that would remain was the paper trail we'd been building, some of which she'd already discredited. Garrett was nervous, but he tried to project confidence. I spent hours going over the possible questions Alyssa might throw at him. He nodded, said he understood, repeated back the key points he needed to emphasize. I had this naive hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd slip up somehow, or that he'd be so composed she wouldn't be able to rattle it. When the moment finally arrived, I could practically taste the tension. Garrett took the stand, and for the first few minutes of cross-examination, Alyssa lured him into a false sense of security. She asked him about the early days of his company, how he and David had been close friends, how they'd talk about their shared vision for a cutting-edge app that would change the world. Garrett smiled, remembering better times, and Alyssa nodded sympathetically. Then, abruptly, her tone shifted. She asked, "Mr. Palmer, would you say you were in charge of the finances at the time Mr. Garrison made these alleged withdrawals?" Garrett hesitated. "Mostly, yes. I mean, we had a loose arrangement, but I had the final say." Alyssa nodded again. "So, you were the ultimate authority on how funds were allocated." He cleared his throat. "Yes, in theory, but we were partners. We discussed everything. David wasn't supposed to move funds without my sign-off." She tapped her pen on the edge of the witness stand. "And yet, the email you sent said, and I quote, 'Go ahead, do whatever you need to do. I trust you with this, man. Let's just get the project rolling.' That doesn't sound like you're withholding sign-off. It sounds like you freely gave permission." His jaw tightened. "It was just a casual way of speaking. It didn't mean I gave him access to tens of thousands of dollars with no accountability." Alyssa made a small show of rifling through a folder before selecting a document. "Let's talk about accountability. You testified earlier that you tried to confront Mr. Garrison about the missing funds multiple times. But according to these text messages," and here she held up a printout for the court to see, "your first mention of missing funds was 2 weeks after you said you'd confronted him in person. Can you explain that discrepancy?" Garrett looked at me, then back at her. "I might have gotten the dates mixed up. It's been a while." Alyssa slid the papers onto the evidence table. "So you got the dates mixed up about a key conversation in this lawsuit? A conversation that, according to you, was your first real attempt to address fraudulent behavior? I'm sure you can understand why that might undermine the credibility of your entire story." And just like that, the cracks started to show. Over the next half hour, she led him through a labyrinth of confusing financial statements, old emails, and statements he'd made earlier in the trial. Each time she found a tiny gap or a slight inconsistency, she pounced. At one point, the judge intervened because Alyssa was getting borderline hostile, but she'd made her point. Garrett left the stand sweating, his eyes haunted by the realization that this might be going down in flames. That night, I sat in my tiny apartment staring at the wall. I had all the boxes of evidence spread out on my dining table, rummaging through them as if I'd find a magic bullet that would save our case. My phone buzzed with a text from Garrett, something like, "We're not losing this, right?" I didn't have the heart to answer honestly, so I lied. "We've got a solid chance. Trust me." The next day was the one that still sends shivers down my spine. The day that truly cemented Alyssa's reputation in my mind as one of the most brutal lawyers I've ever encountered. We had a rebuttal witness, a friend of David Garrison's, who had approached us claiming to have inside knowledge that David had bragged about stashing money away. We thought he'd be our star. Let's call him Travis. Travis was nervous but seemed earnest during our prep session. He insisted he'd heard David make offhand comments about draining the company. So we put him on the stand. He repeated the story, though he seemed a little uneasy. Then Alyssa stood up for cross-examination. She began by painting Travis as a scorned acquaintance, someone who'd had a falling out with David over a personal loan. Travis admitted they'd had a dispute. She asked him about a lawsuit that David had filed against him a year prior. He said it was unrelated. She asked him about some text messages, which apparently implied that Travis was open to getting paid for his testimony. He sputtered, insisting that I never asked for money from Mr. Palmer or his lawyers. But Alyssa calmly produced a screenshot that suggested otherwise. The color drained from Travis's face. She hammered him over and over, and each time he stammered another half-baked explanation. By the end, Travis looked like the most unreliable witness in the world. She tore him apart so thoroughly that by the time she finished, it felt like we'd inflicted a fatal wound on our own case by calling him. The sheer brutality of that takedown was like watching a horror movie in real time. She used his own words, his own texts, to tear down every shred of credibility. Then she ended with a final rhetorical dagger. So, Mr. Woodley, how much were you hoping to receive for this testimony? I just want the jury to be clear on your price for manufacturing these false claims. Travis had no answer. He glanced at me as if I could save him, but there was nothing I could do. That was the moment everyone in the courtroom felt the air get sucked out. The gallery was silent. The jury looked appalled, and I could see the triumph simmering just beneath Alyssa's otherwise impassive expression. The judge called for a short recess. Garrett buried his face in his hands, and I tried to assure him that we'd find a way to recover. But privately, I felt it slipping away. When we returned to court, Alyssa gracefully rested her fingertips on the table and said, Your Honor, in light of recent revelations, I believe it's clear that Mr. Palmer's claims are largely based on questionable testimony and shaky assumptions. I'd like to renew my motion for dismissal on the grounds that the plaintiff has failed to prove his burden. The judge didn't dismiss, but I could see she was tempted. Instead, she allowed us to continue, but the damage was done. To this day, I'm not sure if Travis was genuinely lying or if Alyssa had managed to spin partial truths into a damning narrative. Maybe it was both. That's the thing about a truly skilled attorney. They blur the line between reality and misdirection so deftly that sometimes even you aren't sure which way is up. We limped toward closing arguments. My boss stepped in to deliver ours, trying to salvage the wreckage. He did his best to remind the jury of the suspicious timing, the missing money, the property that David purchased. He implored them not to be swayed by a single bad witness or minor inconsistencies. But I could tell they weren't fully buying it. Alyssa's final statement was a masterclass in dismantling everything we'd built. She spoke quietly at first, reminding the jury of all the holes in our story, building piece by piece. Then, with icy precision, she recapped every moment she'd skewered a witness on cross-examination, every time she'd forced someone to admit an oversight or a lie. Finally, she said, This case is about trust. Mr. Palmer trusted Mr. Garrison. But sometimes in business, people misremember agreements, or they recall them in a way that fits the narrative they want. The evidence shows no wrongdoing here. The burden of proof isn't on Mr. Garrison to prove he didn't do something. It's on Mr. Palmer to prove that he did, and to prove it convincingly. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I believe you'll agree that he simply has not. We lost. The jury deliberated for just over a day and found in favor of David Garrison. When the verdict was read, my stomach twisted so hard I thought I'd be sick. I watched Alyssa, but she didn't gloat. She just nodded once, a quiet acceptance of the victory she clearly expected. Garrett left the courtroom in a daze while a couple of reporters rushed up to him, shoving microphones in his face. I remember the hum of voices in the background, the cold sense of finality. I remember how everything felt heavier. My footsteps, my breath, my heart. That trial changed me in ways I didn't fully grasp until much later. It was my first taste of how ruthless litigation can be, how a well-prepared opponent can decimate even a seemingly strong case. People like to believe that the truth always wins out in court. The reality is more complicated. The truth can be bent, hammered, and shaped by those who know how to use the system. And Alyssa Merrick was an artist at that craft. I'd love to say I recovered swiftly and moved on to win my next big case, but that's not how life works. I spent weeks afterward second-guessing every move I'd made. Could I have prepped Travis differently? Should I have dug deeper into his motivations? Was there a better witness we should have called instead? But the real question that haunted me was whether the outcome would have been different if our opposing counsel hadn't been Alyssa. Maybe any competent lawyer would have poked the same holes. Or maybe not. In the months that followed, I talked to other attorneys who had gone up against her. Each had a war story to tell. Depositions that ended in tears, entire lines of argument gutted in seconds. One senior partner at a different firm told me, facing Alyssa is like running a marathon with a sprained ankle. You might think you can keep up, but she'll get you eventually. Eventually, I found my footing again. I took on smaller cases, won some, lost some. Each time, I tried to apply the lessons I'd always verify your witnesses, never rely too heavily on any one piece of evidence, and always plan for your opponent to be the smartest person in the room. But every so often, I still see the flicker of overhead lights in that courtroom, still smell the stiff leather chairs, still feel the hush when Alyssa rose to speak. It's like a ghost story I can't quite shake. People ask me if I harbor any resentment or bitterness toward her. Honestly, I'm mostly impressed. She was doing her job and she was excellent at it. So excellent it could be terrifying. I suppose you could say she taught me the difference between law school idealism and the gritty realities of a high-stakes trial. She taught me that sometimes, even if you have a fair amount of evidence, you can get annihilated by the way that evidence is presented and dismantled. In the end, what stands out is that single day she tore our key witness apart. I'll never forget the way she paced in front of the jury box, weaving a net of contradictions around him until he was paralyzed. The judge's gavel felt like a punctuation mark on the meltdown of our entire case. And that moment, watching Alyssa methodically destroy that witness, was the most brutal courtroom takedown I've ever witnessed. If there's a silver lining, it's that I became a better lawyer after. I knew what could happen if I didn't prepare for every contingency, if I didn't stress test every witness's story and triple-check every piece of evidence. Sometimes people say to me, how do you stay calm in stressful trials now? And the answer is, once you've been on the receiving end of a savage defeat like that, you learn that panic doesn't help. Caution, thoroughness, and a healthy respect for your opponent do. That's my story. The day Alyssa Merrick made me question my entire career path, stripped away my illusions, and showed me how merciless the courtroom can be when you stand before someone who knows how to wield the law like a scalpel. I don't think I'll ever forget how it felt, sitting at that counsel table, hearing her voice echo in the hush of the room, and realizing with a sinking heart that we were going down. And there was nothing I could do to stop it.